She was 43 years old when she discovered that her entire childhood had been built on a lie. The memories, the stories, the faces and the yellowed photographs. Nothing was real, or rather, it was real, but it wasn't hers. For 4 decades, she carried the weight of a past that belonged to another child, a child who died before he could even form his own memories. And when the truth came out on a cold winter afternoon in Manhattan, she understood. Every decision he made, every fear he carried, every part of who she became. Everything was shaped by a story that was never yours. What is left of you when you discover that the past that built you was someone else's? Helen Margaret Keller grew up listening to stories. Stories about how she almost died at birth, how he spent weeks in an incubator, how miraculous it was that she survived. You were so small, her mother, Dorothy, always said. It fit in the palm of my hand. Helen grew up believing she was special, a survivor, a child who conquered death. This became his identity. She was born in 1941 in Manhattan at Presbyterian Hospital. Or that was what was in the documents, in photo albums, in the family stories. Dorothy was a nurse. Walter, his father, worked as a railway engineer. They were simple, honest people who lived in a small apartment in the Bronx. Helen was an only child. Or at least, that's what she thought. There were baby pictures, lots of photos, a small, light-eyed child wrapped in white blankets. "That's you," Dorothy always said, pointing to the photos. And Helen believed, because children believe. She grew up carrying the weight of that narrative, the miracle child, the survivor, the lucky one, and that shaped everything. Helen was afraid of hospitals, a deep, visceral fear that she could never explain. I had recurring nightmares. She dreamed that she was trapped in a white, cold place where she could not breathe. "They are memories of birth," Dorothy said. "You remember the incubator." Helen accepted, but something has always seemed strange, because the memories were too strong, too vivid, as if they were not only hers. At school, Helen was shy, insecure. I felt that I constantly needed to prove that I deserved to be there, that he deserved to have survived. "You're so strong," people said. But Helen didn't feel strong. He felt fragile, as if at any moment, the luck that kept her alive could run out. At the age of 15, Helen began to have anxiety attacks, panic attacks, inexplicable fear that something terrible was about to happen. Dorothy took her to psychologists, psychiatrists. Birth trauma, they diagnosed. It's common in premature babies. Helen took medication. He went to therapy. But the fear did not go away, because it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, a sense that there was something wrong with his existence, as if she were occupying a space that was not hers. But she never said it out loud, because how to explain something that even she didn't understand? Helen graduated from high school in 1959. She went to college to study nursing. Like his mother, she wanted to help people, saving lives, perhaps unconsciously repaying the fact that I was saved. It was in college that he met Thomas. He was a medical student, tall, gentle, with a smile that soothed even Helen's hardest days. They married in 1963. Helen was 22. Thomas, 25. They went to live in a small apartment on the Upper West Side. Helen worked as a nurse at Mount Sinai. Thomas was doing his residency in pediatrics. They had 2 children, Sarah in 1965 and Michael in 1968. Helen loved being a mother, but I was also afraid. Fear that their children would inherit their fragility. Fear that something would go wrong. Fear of losing them. She was overprotective. I checked if they were breathing during the night. He didn't let them play alone. He took them to the doctor at the slightest sign of coughing. "Helen, you need to relax," Thomas would say. "They're fine." But she couldn't, because for her, life was fragile. It could be taken down at any time. She had always carried this. Dorothy visited the family often. She and Helen were close, or they seemed to be, but there were strange moments. Moments when Dorothy looked at Helen with an expression she couldn't decipher. Sadness, blame, something heavy that was suspended in the air between them. Is everything okay, Mom? Helen asked. All great, dear, Dorothy replied, looking away. Walter died in 1975, at the age of 63, of a heart attack. Helen was devastated, but it was Dorothy who fell apart. She stopped leaving the house. He stopped answering calls. I spent hours sitting alone, staring at nothing. Helen tried to help. She took her grandchildren to visit her. He cooked meals. He cleaned the apartment. But Dorothy seemed to be carrying something much bigger than grief. You should go to therapy, Helen suggested. It's no use, Dorothy said. Some things can't be fixed. Helen didn't understand. But I should have asked more. I should have insisted. In 1982, Dorothy was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months to live. It lasted for the past few days, Dorothy had been in a hospital bed at home. Morphine for pain. Conscious only for brief moments. Helen was by his side when Dorothy opened her eyes and whispered, I need to tell you. Tell what, Mom? About you? Helen frowns you each. I already know about myself. You don't know, Dorothy said, tears flowing. You don't know. What are you talking about? Dorothy tried to continue, but the pain was too strong. She moaned. Helen called the nurse, who increased the dose of morphine. Dorothy closed her eyes, and he never woke up again. Helen was restless for weeks. You don't know. What did Dorothy mean? She tried to ignore it. He blamed the medicines, the delirium of pain. But I couldn't forget it. While cleaning Dorothy's apartment, Helen found a box in the back of the closet. Inside, old documents, certificates, hospital records. Helen began to flip through, and then he did. A death certificate. Helen Margaret Keller, date of birth. April 14th, 1941, date of death. April 18th, 1941, cause. Respiratory complications. Helen read it again. And again. Your name. Your date of birth. But a death certificate. She searched for more. He found another birth certificate. A different one. Name, Rebecca and Carter, date of birth. April 15th, 1941, parents. Unknown. Helen held the papers with trembling hands. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. She called Thomas. I found something. Something very wrong. Helen hired a private investigator. She handed over all the documents she could find. He asked for answers. It took 2 weeks. The investigator came back with a detailed report, and what he told destroyed everything. In April 1941, Dorothy Keller gave birth to a baby girl at Presbyterian Hospital. The baby was premature, with severe respiratory problems. Dorothy and Walter named her Helen Margaret, but Helen died 4 days later. Dorothy was devastated. He went into a deep depression. I couldn't accept the loss. At the same hospital, in the same week, another baby was born, a girl abandoned by her biological mother, unnamed, no family. Dorothy worked at that hospital as a nurse, and in a moment of despair, pain, and madness, she made a decision. She took the abandoned baby home. And I told everyone that it was Helen, that his daughter had survived. No one questioned it. Hospital records were chaotic at the time. The checks minimal. Dorothy falsified documents. He created a new birth certificate, and he raised that child as Helen Margaret Keller. The real Helen, Dorothy's biological daughter, was buried in a cemetery in Queens, and the girl who grew up as Helen was actually Rebecca and Carter, an abandoned child that he never knew who he really was. Helen sat in the investigator's office, unable to process. I'm not Helen, she whispered. No, you're Rebecca, but I lived 43 years like Helen. I know. My mother, did she rob me? The investigator paused. She lost her daughter, and he found a child that no one wanted. It's not as simple as theft. But it was. That was exactly it. Dorothy stole the identity of her dead daughter and gave it to another child. And Helen, Rebecca, lived her entire life carrying the weight of a death that was not her own. Helen returned home in shock. Thomas greeted her at the door. What happened? She told everything. He showed the documents. He explained the truth. Thomas turned pale. So, aren't you who we thought you were? No. He sat heavily on the couch. But does that change anything? It changes everything, Helen said, her voice breaking. I've spent my whole life carrying someone else's story, the traumas of another person, the fear, the guilt, the feeling of not deserving to be alive. It was all because I was living the shadow of a dead child. Thomas tried to hug her, but Helen pulled away. I need to be alone. She locked herself in her room and cried. She cried for the child she was, for the child he could have been. He cried for Dorothy, who lost a daughter and never managed to get over it. And she cried for the real Helen, the baby who died and had her name stolen. Helen told her children. Sarah was shocked. Michael, incredulous. So Grandma Dorothy wasn't your real mother? Sarah asked. She created you, but biologically, Michael began. I don't know, Helen interrupted. I don't know who my biological parents are. I don't know where I come from. I don't know anything. The feeling of emptiness was absolute. Helen always felt that there was something wrong with her existence. And now she knew why. Because she should never have been Helen. She was Rebecca, an abandoned child. No story, no origin. And Dorothy had tried to erase that, create a new narrative. But the truth has always been there. In the photographs that didn't match. In the memories that were too strange. In the fear that Helen could never explain. It was a shadow of the dead Helen. And Helen, Rebecca, had lived her whole life in the darkness of that shadow. Helen needed to know more. She returned to Presbyterian Hospital. He asked for records from 1941. Many had been lost, but he found some. There was a note about Rebecca and Carter. Abandoned baby. Mother unknown. Left on the stairs of the hospital. Nothing more. No name. No clue. Helen hired more investigators. He tried to trace its origin. Impossible. It was 1984. There were no digital databases. There were no DNA tests accessible. Whoever had left Rebecca in that hospital in 1941 was gone forever. Helen visited the cemetery in Queens. She found the tombstone. Helen Margaret Keller, 1941. To 1941, our little angel. Helen knelt before the tombstone, and he apologized. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know I was living in your place. She left flowers, and he cried, because that child, the real Helen, never had a chance to live. And she, Rebecca, had lived a life that wasn't her own. Neither had been fair. Helen tried to find out more about Dorothy. She talked to old coworkers, old neighbors. They all said the same thing. Dorothy never recovered from the loss of her daughter. She changed after the baby was born. A former colleague said, it was distant, strange, as if I were carrying a huge weight. Because it was. She had buried her real daughter and spent 41 years pretending she was still alive. Helen could never confront Dorothy. She was dead, but she could confront the truth. And the truth was complex. Dorothy had done something terrible. He had stolen the identity of a dead child. He had lied for decades, but it had also saved a life. Because without Dorothy, Rebecca would have grown up in foster care. Or worse, she would never have had a family, a home, love. Helen hated Dorothy for being lied to, but she was also grateful. And this ambiguity was unbearable. How to hate and love at the same time. How to be thankful for something that also destroyed you. Helen went to therapist. I don't know who I am anymore, she said. Am I Helen? Or Rebecca? Or neither? The therapist was silent for a long time. You are who you choose to be. But how do you choose when you never had a choice? Helen looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person she saw. 43 years of a life built on someone else's past. 43 years carrying fears that were not his. Memories that were not his. A death that was not his. How do you deconstruct this? How do you rebuild an identity from scratch? Helen decided to keep the name, not because it was true, but because it was all she knew. Rebecca and Carter was an outsider, a child who never existed beyond 4 days in 1941. Helen Margaret Keller was who she had been for 43 years. Lie or not, it was his identity. But now she carried both. The abandoned child, the dead child, both lived inside it. Helen went on with her life. She continued to be a nurse. She continued to be a mother, wife, but something had changed. She stopped having nightmares. Because now I understood where they came from. They were not memories of her. They were echoes of the original Helen, the child who struggled to breathe and lost. Helen visited the cemetery every month. He took flowers. He talked to the tombstone. "I live for you," she said. "I hope it was a good enough life." In 1990, Helen wrote a book, not to publish, just to process. She wrote about identity, about being built from other people's parts, about carrying the weight of a death that was not his, about loving someone who lied to you. "Who are we?" she wrote on the last page. "Are we our names, our parents, our memories, or are we something that exists beyond all that?" Helen never found the answer, but he learned to live with the question. Sarah and Michael supported her. So did Thomas. "You're the same person," Thomas would say. "The name doesn't matter." But it mattered because names carry stories. And Helen had carried the wrong story her whole life. Helen died in 2008 at the age of 67. At the funeral, Thomas asked to bury her next to the tombstone of the original Helen. They should be together, he said. And now they are. 2 girls. 2 names. A single life lived. Who was real? Both. And none of them. New York, 1984. A woman discovers that she has lived 43 years, carrying the past of a child she never knew. A child who died before being able to form his own memories. And she, the abandoned child, received a name that was not hers, a story that was not his, a shadow that shaped every part of who she became. How many versions of ourselves exist within a single lifetime? And when we find out that we were built on false foundations, what is left? Leave it in the comments. And sign up to follow other stories of people who discovered that the past they carried was never really theirs.